probably all heard those arguments before and are aware of them. And especially in this weather, I probably don't need to be reminded about climate change. But on we go. And here are the principal wind farms in central Scotland, Braes of Doon, north of Doon. And these are probably all familiar landmarks for you. Braes of Doon being very visible from the whole area. There's Earlsburn and Craigengilt in the Gargunnocks and Carn Valley, Burnfoot and Greenknowes in the Ochils, and we've got the two lowland sites, Burnhead and Todd Hill, down near Falkirk. There may be one or two others that fall into our area, but that's the principal ones anyway. One thing I'm also going to say is that there's a couple of pretty gruesome bird wind farm fatality shots. So in case anybody's upset, I'll try and warn you when they are coming up. So what impacts of wind farms on wildlife? The obvious, one of the obvious ones is habitat loss. You see the big area. Where's our pointer, by the way?
Just use mouse on the screen.
Oh, oh, there we go. So this big area, you see, that's like known as the hard stand or the crane pad. So obviously there's a loss of habitat from the installation of that. There's mortality through turbine strike, which is probably the obvious one that people think about. And we'll be looking at that. Other mortality as well. Sometimes birds hit temporary weather masts and the cables securing temporary weather masts, sometimes even vehicles on site. There's disturbance during the construction period. Now, all big infrastructure projects, including wind farms, appoint somebody called an ecological clerk of works, and they make sure the construction company is kind of not breaking any laws regarding protected species. So they are there to make sure that when tracks and infrastructure is being built, that no nesting birds are disturbed and no badger sets, otter holts, etc. are destroyed or disturbed. And if they are to be destroyed and disturbed, then that can be done under license from Nature Scot. Just as a kind of aside, just for the historians, one thing that's done in the pre-construction period is that there are archaeological surveys as well. Now, I'm not aware if anything's been found at the Braes of Doon, but I was working a wind farm down in Dumfries a couple of years ago, and they found some nice Bronze Age burial urns, I think they're called, in the path of the access track. So the archaeologists do go in and find these things. They also at the Braes of Doon did an ordnance survey looking for unexploded ordnance, because it was the firing range, MOD range up near Cymru. So again, I don't think we found anything, but they also surveyed for unexploded ordnance. And then there's disturbance in the post-construction period. As you can imagine, some of these areas are quite inaccessible. Then suddenly there's a big track route, and it might be off limits to the public driving, but certainly walking and mountain biking can take place, and very often does, at these sites. And as Roy was reminding me in an email recently, there's also, there can be minor atmospheric climatic effects just from the actions of the blades, and that can possibly have an effect on plant species. So we'll talk about the Braes of Doon red kite study. It's an easy place to start. There's probably very few other studies that focus on one species and one wind farm, and have been carried out over a considerable period and done with that intensity. So I'm just going to talk through briefly some of the methods that we use. So vantage point watches are a standard one used at wind farms. So there's 3-hour watches done at various points around the wind farm and the whole area. And the target species are when they're sighted, their flight lines are plotted on the map, and every 15 seconds their height is recorded in various bands. And the point of that is to do something called collision risk modelling. And that is a way of just estimating how many birds they think will be killed by the turbines. So that was done a couple of years, it carried on right to the end of the project, but the first 2 years, the data collected estimated to be something like 1.3 kites on average a year would be killed by the wind farm. And that was modelled, and it was predicted that that level of mortality wouldn't affect the growth of the kite population, which in those days was still relatively new. So radio tracking study, I'll come back to, that was to actually find out the movements of the birds in relation to the wind farm, and potentially get any dead birds mortality, because through the work of the RSPB, which I did some of that myself, it is possible to actually retrieve birds that have been, in that case, illegally poisoned. So you can actually find recover dead birds through radio tracking. Turbine searches as well, just to find any carcasses that may be on the ground, because not the whole population of kites obviously wasn't tagged, so it was to look for any kites that may have been killed. And with 36 turbines in the Braes, it wasn't possible to search them all every day, so three were searched a week in a rolling programme, and there was 130-metre plots around each turbine. Whoops. And they were transected 10 metres apart, so you're searching 5 metres on either side. We thought it was a reasonable distance to see a bird size of a red kite. I know it started in 2007 and finished in 2011, I think. And then to test how many birds we may have been missing, we did carcass removal and search efficiency trials, which I shall come back to. So radio tracking study, we used transmitters like these, 22-gram backpacks, which were fitted like a backpack would be in a person, so around the shoulders and around the waist, with the wings obviously free. And we fitted 84 birds with these transmitters and able to study 79 in a meaningful way. Some of them had died just leaving the nest or just left the area before they could be properly studied. So how did we get them on? Well, we got braver people than me to climb the trees, people, representatives of the RSPB Scotland, Central Scotland Raptor Study Group and Forestry Commission Scotland, as well as Natural Research, who's the company I was employed by to carry out this study. And yeah, we would just load the birds down in a bag, put on the transmitters and take them up again. And also add patagial wing tags that you see there, so the birds could be visually identified, which is handy if the transmitters happen to fail. So we set about studying the birds and start the radio tracking work a couple of years before the construction was complete, so we get an idea of the movements of the birds sort of before, during and after construction, and also the vantage points continued as well. And so the wind farm was commissioned in 2007, started operating then, and very quickly we got this, which was our first red kite fatality. And it was actually a bit disconcerting that it happened so quickly after the site was commissioned. And it's quite an interesting kind of anecdote about how I found this. It wasn't actually found through the systematic turbine searches. I just happened to be, I think I'd been going to do some breeding bird survey, which was another thing we did there, and just got rained off. And I just thought, well, I'll just go and do some ad hoc kite observations, see if there's anything about. And I saw this bird kite circling around one particular turbine. It was very clearly looking at something on the ground. I thought, well, it's obviously a turbine strike, and it had, and it was this bird. And it was a 2-year-old female, which we identified it from its ring. It had wing tags, but they'd come off, so we could identify which bird it was. But we don't know, because its wing tags come off, we don't know what nest site it was from. So that was 2nd of July. So if it was involved in a nesting attempt, the chicks probably would have been big enough, then they might be all right. And if the male continued to provision them, they might have even left the nest by that point. But it could be that a nesting attempt was compromised because of that. But our next one wasn't until 2009. And that bird was found through the systematic turbine searches. And only the back half was found, because we'll see that there can be amazingly precise injuries on the birds and literally cut them in two. You can imagine, it's difficult to imagine how something as big as a turbine blade, 40 metres in the case of Braesadune, could actually kind of make such a precise injury. Anyway, that was a radio tag bird, and we only found the back half of it. It was identified by its ring, never recovered the front half. And then another one was found by site staff the following year. And again, that was on it was on the road, and there was 3 or 4 kites circling around it. And fair play to the wind farm staff, they actually shut the turbines down, the immediate turbines. So fair play to them for that. So that was our 3 fatalities. So just look at the overall results. So yes, recovered 3 birds. And yeah, that was in line with a predicted mortality of 1.3 kites killed through turbine strike every year. But yeah, there was a bit of a postscript to that. It was another bird found in 2014. And there was also a satellite tagged bird, or satellite tagged by RSPB up in Inverness. That was also recovered around the same time. So basically it was 5 kites killed in about 7 years. So that's in line with what was predicted. We did also find that through all the techniques that there was a reduction in use of the wind farm area by the kites towards the end of the study. But we think rather than the birds just being afraid of the turbines, we think it was due to changing patterns of use by the population. The reason we think that is we still had a lot of birds flying through the wind farm at that point. But because the kite population was relatively new at that point, it was still evolving, and it was spreading through central Scotland. And at one time, Doon was the kind of centre, really, the population in terms of numbers of nests and communal roosts, which they hold mainly the young birds. But through the 2000s, actually, the population spread further north and east, and most of the nests and larger communal roosts were up in Crieff and Cymru area. And I think it was just that birds were spending less time up there, less time in the Doon area and more time up near Crieff and Cymru. And we could see that from the radio tracking that sometimes with 20 or 30 birds with active radio transmitters, you might only get 2 or 3 roosting at Doon in the winter. So that the radio tracking work supported that. There was also a radio tracking study at Earlsbourne, which I did around the same time, much less intense. It was only 2 days a month. But again, it showed that most of the radio tag kites weren't going anywhere near Earlsbourne, and were just heading north from Doon. I did get one interesting result where a bird seemed to have roosted in the Campsie Fells and had it coming over the Earlsbourne wind farm and heading for Doon in the morning. But that was a rare exception. Really, the radio tag population just went north. So that kind of supported results of the Braes of Doon. And you've got to remember that you've got to see the losses that were incurred in context. That first bird I showed you, that's 2007. That was one of 17 from the Central Scotland population that was recovered dead that year. And out of those 17, 11 were killed by illegal persecution, and a further 2 were suspected to be illegal persecution. So that puts the wind farm losses in context. So we can say that it really appears that the Braes of Doon is not, through mortality, reduced the kite population or stunted its population growth. So that's one result we can be pretty confident about. Now you might wonder, well, how do we know we found all the birds that could have been killed? So we did some carcass removal trials, such efficient carcass removal trials, east of the wind farm, similar area in terms of altitude, habitat. The rest of it, we did 9 rounds covering spring, autumn, winter. And that was in relation to what we thought would be the main scavenger, the fox, with its cubbing in spring, dispersal of young animals in autumn, and of course winter, low supply of food. So initially we used pheasants because these were easily available and of vaguely similar size to a kite. You can see it, one there. And we did that, and a lot of these birds, they weren't all removed in night 1 by foxes, and some of them lasted up to 25 days. But there was work in America that showed that the commonly available species to use for these trials, so pheasants, poultry, pigeons, are actually just a lot more palatable to scavengers. So we thought it would be good if we could get a supply of raptors to use. So we contacted the Scottish Agricultural Science Agency. That's the body that does, toxicological monitoring and just general monitoring of wildlife. And we were able to get a supply of buzzards. Now, they'd all been tested, as I say, for poison. None of them have been poisoned illegally or otherwise, so they were safe to put out. So there's no threat to any scavengers, probably mainly roadkills or collisions with wires or what have you. So we used them, and it did, as you see at the bottom, the buzzards did last a hell of a lot longer, and it was, they were less palatable to the foxes. And in fact, in one case, I found a buzzard carcass that had been dragged 3 meters by a fox and just left, and we could see its footprints in the bare peat, so we knew it being a fox. So they just lasted a lot longer, and not only did the carcasses last a lot longer, there's feather patches that last for months and months. So even if they were eaten by other scavengers, we did get one that seemed to be eaten by another raptor, possibly a kite, but the feather patches could last a long time. So there would be evidence that there had been a strike, even if in most cases the carcass had been scavenged. And our searcher found 83% of the carcasses laid out. So we'd lay them out, do the searcher trials, and just leave them in situ to see what would happen. So that kind of backed up our conclusion that we can't say we found every kite that would have been killed, but our ballpark figure was, pretty spot on. So let's have a look at some of the other species found. And this is a list here. And at the top is, if you can read that, is gannet. And you might think, well, what's going on there? Gannet praise the Doon. Well, it's actually quite common that gannets cross the Scottish mainland. And they found out from satellite tagging birds in the North Sea that quite regularly they cross Scotland and feed on the west coast. And I've certainly seen a bird over Stirling. I saw one over Barnton Street. I've seen 3 over Dunblane. I've seen one a couple of years ago over Bucclivie, and one was seen from the vantage points that I was describing earlier. So it's actually not as mad as it seems that a gannet might get hit. It was identified by its feathers. We sent feathers off to top ornithologists to confirm identification. See the kite there, kestrel, merlin, which will come back to, peregrine even. Lots of red grouse, and probably most of them were just, because they're living on the ground around big turbines, most of them probably weren't turbine related. Things like common gull, long-eared owl was an interesting one, and some passerines down at the bottom. Also down at the bottom, you'll see Soprano pipistrel bat, which I'll be talking a bit about as well. And we found some other carcasses just in ad hoc circumstances. Again, at the top, little grebe, that sounds like a mad one if you know birds, but it's actually quite common that little grebes move about at night time. I know somebody that was doing something called nocturnal migration, NOTMIG, in Dunblane. It's basically recording what goes over during the night, and it's quite common that little grebes move about during the night and move about between water bodies. So again, it sounds unlikely, but little grebe is, was one of the casualties. Again, some of the raptor casualties then. I said red grouse were probably mainly non-turbine related. We did find one that had actually flown into the tower, and especially in sort of breeding season, they're doing their displays and they're chasing rivals and the rest of it. They're flying through the mist. You can easily imagine how that would have happened. And again, one bat at the bottom. So just talk about some of the species. Kestrel, this bird that's been cut in half. This is not one of the gory ones, by the way. Kestrel is actually quite a common victim of turbine strike. They are in Spain, and it seems that they are relatively common in Scotland. How many we don't know, because there are so few studies that are doing sustained turbine searches at wind farms. But in the first couple of years of the operation of Whiteley wind farm, which is a big one south of Glasgow, there was about nine found killed, one of which I found myself, just ad hoc, just driving around. So there was 9 killed at Whiteley. We fed them there was at least one at Earlsbourne and one at Green Knowes. So they're probably quite a common victim. Now, kestrels have declined by about 65% between the 90s and 2000s, and probably continued to decline. How much of that is to do with wind farms? Well, there's no evidence at all. I wouldn't be surprised though if they do, they may well have a hand in that decline. The major one that's touted is, well, it's an increase in the larger raptors that are predators and competitors to them. Goshawks, for example, quite commonly kill kestrels and kill quite a lot. At one time, kestrel was the only raptor you'd see, but there's now larger raptors, which are far more common. Agriculture's also trotted out as a possible for a decline. But anyway, that's food for thought. An interesting one about one of the kestrels, it was ringed, and it was ringed at Lake of Menteith, which is 13 kilometres or miles, I can't remember which, away, but that was quite an interesting finding. Merlins. We had 3 merlins killed, and 3 interesting things about that. This is a juvenile bird photographed in Raised Wind Farm. And we actually found 2 at the same turbine almost exactly a year apart, late August. And the 3rd was found at adjacent turbine. So it seemed to be that time of year, and that part of the wind farm seemed to be significant. It's possible that there was birds breeding in the heather, ground nesting birds further over towards Glenartney, and that could have been the source. It was also notable that at that time, merlins were actually a scarcer bird in Britain than red kites. At that point, it was something like 1,200 UK merlin pairs versus 1,800 red kite pairs. So in conservation terms, that was almost more significant finding. I'm not aware of anybody who's done any more research into impact of wind farms on merlins, but that was interesting. And the 3rd thing was that they were killed at all, because those that we know merlins, that they actually fly very low, just a few feet off the ground after things like meadow pipits. And you wouldn't imagine that would be a bird that we go into rotor swept height. So the lower edge of rotor swept height was 25 metres. It's 25 to 105 was the full span. So you didn't expect that merlins would actually be particularly vulnerable. However, there was one occasion I saw a merlin chasing a meadow pipit within the wind farm, and it was chasing it along, and the meadow pipit went like that, probably to escape, and the merlin went after it and got it. So it's it's possibly that they hunt and catch prey higher up than we commonly observe them. So that was one interesting find. So this is the kind of the gruesome couple of shots are coming up. So this was a buzzard. I don't remember the first shot. There was a buzzard on the hard standy. You might have spotted that. But this was the first fatality we found. It was actually found by somebody finishing off some of the post-construction work. And this bird was a wing-tagged bird, wing-tagged in Doon. Again, like the kite that we never found the front half, we never found the back half of this. So parts can be propelled some distance. Now, I decided to post-mortem every get on post-mortems because even more so than now, wind farms were very controversial then, and you know, there was sensitivities about birds. So I thought it was very important to make sure there was like a professional opinion to what had killed these birds. So when I took this to the vet, he actually was initially sceptical it had been killed by a turbine because he thought, how could it do that? Because both wind farms were new then, so they hadn't. So yeah, vets hadn't seen many wind farm casualties. So I got in touch with people in Europe, and they sent me this. And you'll see the bottom right, that buzzard there matches very closely what we found at the Braes. And at that, the kite picture, red kite top right, well, that's just incredible, you know, how precise that can be. As I say, the fact they can cut a bird the size of a kestrel in two, you just think how we can. Well, of course, they do come to such a point, they're aerodynamically designed that they come to a point and a very sharp leading edge. So that's how that happens. So other bird species killed by wind turbines. This is by no means a definitive list. This is just a kind of an array of birds that can be killed, have been killed at wind farms, and not necessarily all in our area. Some of them are ones, just one that I've put in because I've found them myself. The one that is relevant to us is the white-tailed eagle. Top right, that was actually found killed 2014 at Burnfoot Wind Farm in the Ochils, and it was the first one killed in Scotland. I think there might have been a second one killed at some point in the Hebrides, but thankfully there's been very few sea eagle, white-tailed eagle fatalities. That was one of the birds that was released in the Fife reintroduction project. Hen harrier, we've had 3 killed up. Griffin near Aberfeldy, kestrel and buzzard, as we mentioned already. Black grouse, one on the west coast that was like the red grouse I mentioned, actually flew into the tower, wasn't actually hit by the blades. Snipe we've had in recent years. And then you see a number of passerine songbirds on the left there. And again, you think, well, how do you know these were killed by wind turbines? Well, they've been found underneath the turbine, a hard stand area, like we see here. And some of these have just sat and basically decomposed. So as we found with the carcass trials, it's not the case that everything that gets killed gets carried off by a fox on night one. They can actually persist for some time. And some of these birds like the red poll, chaffinch, they just had sat and decomposed. So the skeleton's intact, they hadn't been scavenged. And the other thing is that these are woodland birds and are found in treeless areas. So it's consistent with birds moving from one woodland block to another. They haven't just fallen off their perch in the middle of the night because it was a treeless area. So that's just some more species which have been involved. And it's probably true that most species are vulnerable to some extent. One species which thankfully isn't that vulnerable to turbine strike is golden eagle, which we have, of course, in Stirlingshire. How am I doing for time?
1 minute, 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay.
Well, you're now on, we started a little bit late, so it's 2:10.
Okay, right, that's all. Oh, that's great, right. So yeah, there's a research paper coming out last year which shows that young golden eagles, satellite tagged ones, are very good at avoiding wind turbines, big wind development. So that's a bit of good news. And there's a study on Kintyre which suggests that the adults do similar. Bats, we had 3 bats there. I'm not going to say too much about bats because it's not really my specialism, but this was one of the bats, soprano pipistrelle, found at the Braes. Been involved at another wind farm where found some bat, been doing searches down there. And I don't know if there's any research showing the effect on the population, but it's estimated that 3,000 to 5,000 pipistrelle bats of the two species are killed every year at British wind farms. You see again, that one's quite desiccated. That's lain there for some time. Another one there. Mountain hares. These aren't really affected by wind farms at all. We used to see a lot more of them after the construction of the wind farm, but not convinced that's because an increase. It might just be that it's easier to see. We've got a track route, you can see them from the vehicle. So positive impacts, habitat mitigation. Just about every wind farm has got a habitat action plan, which are carried out often to the benefit of things like these, which are black grouse. Habitat creation as well. You can get everything from ditches in the new infrastructure that are good for frogs and the rest of it. You get rock work again in the river water crossings that I've seen used by grey wagtails, pied wagtails, wheatears, things like that. So that I see the nesting opportunities. And this is a wind farm, not in our area, but all ours were built on the open hill, but increasingly wind farms are built in forested areas. And this site you see here in Lanarkshire, this was all conifers, and it's been cleared. You don't want trees for aerodynamic reasons in a wind farm. So it was all cleared out, and they've re-wetted it to block the drains. So it's been put back into bog. And although there's a negative, side for birds and bats, this is hugely beneficial for invertebrates, plants, reptiles, amphibians. And here's a thought that the way the uplands have been planted up with conifers, maybe some of these wind farm sites could become refuges for a lot of these species. Whiteley, for example, there was a square kilometre of forest just cleared and not to be replanted, and that was reused by red grouse and skylarks very quickly. One species benefited from wind farms, just to finish up, ring plover. And that wind farm I showed you, again, that was a forest's site. And since all the forest is gone, 6 or 8 pairs of ring plovers have moved in. That's the bird incubating there. So that's obviously a positive benefit for that species. Again, that's a species that's declined by something like 37% over the 90s and 2000s. So that's a species which has hugely benefited from that site, and the species also bred at Earlsbourne Wind Farm. So conclusions, many species appear not to be affected by wind farms at the population level, at least. For many bird species, population effects are still actually unknown, so we don't know. Impacts on wildlife often difficult to assess due to lack of data sharing. A lot of these habitat management action plans and results of surveys are actually pretty, they're not covered up, but they're just not particularly accessible. So that's a problem in assessing the impacts. But populations, we don't know. As I said, wind farms can benefit through habitat creation and mitigation. These are some of the people that have helped me carry out some of this work, especially with things like tree climbing and to fit radio transmitters. And if you fancy some light holiday reading, that's some further references there. So thanks for listening.